Mrs. De Silva.
Here.
Mr. Valentine.
Here.
Mrs. Gillis.
Here.
Mrs. Rigby.
Here.
Mrs. Messick.
Here.
Thank you. And now we're a motion to appoint Tyson Hodges as Treasurer Pro Tem for this board meeting only appointment to terminate automatically upon close of the meeting. Do I have a motion?
So moved.
So moved by Mr. Valentine. Is there a second?
Second.
Second by Mrs. De Silva. Call the roll, please.
Mr. Valentine.
Yes.
Mrs. De Silva.
Yes.
Mrs. Gillis.
Yes.
Mrs. Rigby.
Yes.
Mrs. Messick.
Yes.
Motion passes 5-0. We are now going to move on to our Pledge of Allegiance, and we have some guests here with us tonight.
Mr. Dockler, can you introduce our guests? I will have them introduce themselves. Go ahead.
And this is Mr. Coe. He works in our building as a paraprofessional. They are representatives of one of our most popular clubs. That's the Board Game Club. So every week they come together. They're in our library now, but eventually they'll go across the street to the what's it called? Beyond the Board. Game store. And what I love about it is that no electronics. They're playing board games. They're interacting. They're socializing. And he's been averaging right around 50 kids every time they meet. So, and this is just a small.
What's your guys' favorite board game? Yeah.
Uno. That's a good one.
Great.
But thank you guys for the opportunity to be here tonight.
Thank you for joining us this evening.
Thank you. Do you want to get a picture?
All right. Approval of regular meeting minutes. Is there a motion?
So moved.
So moved by Mrs. Rigby. Is there a second?
Second.
Second by Mrs. De Silva. Call the roll, please.
Mrs. Rigby.
Yes.
Mrs. De Silva.
Yes.
Mr. Valentine.
Yes.
Mrs. Gillis.
Yes.
Mrs. Messick.
Yes.
Motion passes 5-0. Approval of regular work session minutes. Is there a motion?
So moved.
So moved by Mr. Valentine. Is there a second?
Second.
Second by Mrs. Messick. Call the roll, please.
Mr. Valentine.
Yes.
Mrs. Messick.
Yes.
Mrs. Rigby.
Yes.
Mrs. De Silva.
Yes.
And Mr. Valentine. No.
No.
Mrs. Gillis.
Yes. Motion passes 5-0. And approval of agenda for this evening. Is there a motion? Sorry. Mr. Valentine, second by Mrs. Silva. Call the roll, please.
Mr. Valentine.
Yes.
Mrs. De Silva,
Yes.
Mrs. Rigby,
Yes.
Mrs. Gillis,
Yes.
Mrs. Messick.
Yes.
Motion passes 5-0. Moving on to presentations, and we have Mr. Melodies here this evening to join us for our tolls update.
Good evening, Dr. Marshausen, members of the board, Madam President. I'm here with the September tolls update. You should have the report in board docs, was on the website as well. Just a few updates I want to highlight you on. Sorry about that. Last month at the end of August, on August 30th, we had the ribbon cutting for the new Cyber Lab. That was a fantastic event. A lot of people turned out from community partners and representatives. It was a great turnout. The lab looks fantastic. Two sides of it, a lot of hard work went into that. And it's just a state-of-the-art lab for the cyber program. I wanted to highlight on October the 5th, Tolls is having their 50th anniversary celebration. That's a Saturday from 10 to 1. So if your calendar allows you, please come out and you can tour Tolls, see some of the programs, and also see the new Cyber Lab. And if you know of any distinguished alumni or former teachers or anyone associated with Tolls in the past that would like a special invite, please let me know and I can have them added to the list to make sure that they get an invite as well as part of that announcement. Continuing on facility updates for Tolls, we continue to do design and planning for the facility expansion that we are in the process of. Again, that's a $30 million facility expansion, targeting for groundbreaking this coming spring in April or May. Primarily, that'll be for construction, welding, and pre-nursing labs. That's our focus. And then continuing on the expansion note, this September, we did initiate 2 new adult education programs, HVAC and electrical programs. These were programs we had in the past, but due to the need in the community in Central Ohio, we have brought back those programs and looking forward to getting more people into the workforce. There's also a note in here about work-based learning. There's about 100 students this year enrolled in work-based learning programs through Tolls. This is a 2x2 cohort program where they are employed full-time in the workplace for 2 weeks, and then they come back to Tolls full-time between Tolls and their home school for 2 weeks to continue their education. And that program continues to grow in popularity. And then the final note, Tolls enrollment at the beginning of the year at September 4th, actually, is 1,084 students. That is up over 100 students from last year. And there are 257 students in Dublin attending Tolls this year. And I had a note from Ms. Brigsby yesterday about enrollment in the programs and withdrawals specifically. As you can see in the monthly enrollment statement, there were 25 students that have withdrawn from Tolls since the beginning of the year. And I don't have the answer to your question yet. We're researching it. But she asked that with those 25 withdrawals, if there were program students on wait list that were able to attend in place of those people that withdrew. The only programs with the wait list at the beginning of the year, though, were cosmetology and welding. And there were actually a couple of withdrawals, in 2 in cosmetology and 1 in welding. So we're going back to see if we were able to backfill with the next person on the wait list for those programs. So, and I think that concludes my update, unless there are any other questions.
Thank you, sir.
All right.
Appreciate it.
Thank you, and I'll see you tomorrow morning at the BAC meeting.
We'll be here.
All right. Have a good evening.
Thank you. All right, moving on. Cassie, I'm assuming we do not have, okay. All right, we are moving on to Board of Education committees. Anyone have an update they want to share?
Either one. Go ahead. I do. It was the STAC meeting that Mrs. Messick and I attended. So at the beginning of the year, there's always a lot of things that go on, so I'll just try to kind of give the bullet points. There was discussion around middle school electives from the teacher standpoint that maybe the rollout wasn't as smooth as it could be, and they have some learning to do to feel comfortable teaching these classes. And I was encouraged by the Friday report that I think Jen had already met with Lori and the team to kind of talk about some solutions there. So that was good to know. Middle school advisory periods, currently there are 2 a week, down from daily. And teachers had asked for 3, but we want to give the 2 per week more time. And then the amount of these periods, they are consistent among all the schools. There was discussion also about the metric for advanced classes and the need to possibly recalibrate. Just want to make sure that the kids who are taking advanced classes truly belong in those classes, both for the student and for the teacher, to make sure that that student can succeed. And if they don't, then a consequence of that would be the grade that reflects their capability in that class. And then there was a little bit more talk on Bishop Elementary School, the update there, how construction is coming. And then the Scioto addition, I thought it was great because 10 to 15 Scioto staff will be able to tour Jerome's new addition and provide feedback to Mr. Cochran. So I think that's very helpful. The New Solutions K-12 work with EL, special ed, and gifted. Again, this is an area where Nate Levinson's team will be in the buildings for 2 to 3 day intervals in September, October. And again, 40 staff members are going to be involved in that work. The goal being to serve students at a high level while also being able to maintain a better kind of quality of life for teachers, so that they're working smarter, not necessarily harder for those students. So I guess my take-home message from the meeting is, I thought Jen and John did a great job talking about how we can't continue to operate in the same way, how we made a promise to voters that, we would be more efficient, we would run the district more efficiently, and sometimes that requires hard decisions, saying no, whether it's, to a student who may not get the first choice in scheduling, to a student who may not be in the appropriate class, to a teacher who has maybe 1 or 2 over what they normally would have. We can't just say, okay, well, we'll add another section, we'll add another teacher. So I just applaud the team. I know sometimes that message is very hard to deliver, and it's not one that everybody wants to hear, but I just want to say thank you. From my perspective, sitting there listening to that, just being reinforced, and again, I think getting everyone together and sharing that message and thinking about ways to do things more efficiently and smarter is a good thing. So thank you.
I just want to add to that, again, thank you, and Diana did a great job of summarizing everything. The one thing that I took away from it is class sizes at all 3 levels were a concern. Because as we right-size everything, we have to make sure that we can't just add another teacher, like Diana said, or another section. But along with that comes those hard decisions, because that means that there's nowhere for kids to move if they want to change classes. Hence why we have to make sure that those students are placed originally in their right class. So if they're not ready to take AP or honors, there's not something that they can just drop down into because those classes are full, and that's why we need to do it at the outset rather than letting them in and say, well, try it for a month and go back. So that was really a good message to hear, that we're going to have to stop it before it starts to make sure those classes are right-sized. And just the message that was given to the teachers that taking care of their own personal health and mental health is also important. So even though you have more papers to grade, more students to see, that means you have to maybe do things differently in the classroom, and that's okay. And I know that I talked to Jen afterwards, getting that message out to teachers that it is okay to change the way you've always been doing it, so you can buy back some of that time for yourself. So thank you for taking care of our teachers.
Thank you for that update. And then just to know, community meetings are starting to roll out. We have key communicators this week and PTO leadership. And then Friday evening, we have our Hall of Fame induction, if any of you guys are able to make that, which is exciting. So that brings us to our student representative update.
Hi, good evening. This week at Jerome, students are participating in Homecoming Spirit Week as their dance is this Saturday, and they play against Westerville Central for the big homecoming game. At Scioto, on September 18th, they're hosting a homecoming pop-up shop for students to find dresses and suits for the dance, and their football team beat Thomas Worthington 35-19, and their volleyball team won the Dublin Tri tournament. They also hosted a club fair Tuesday, August 27th to get students involved. At Emerald Campus, IB students started a garden at Wyandotte Elementary to promote sustainability. The products they create from the garden will be given to the Dublin Food Pantry. And in addition, students at Emerald Campus are working on Project Linus. Students created blankets that will be donated to children ages 1 through 18 who are seriously ill, traumatized, or otherwise in need. And so that is all I have for you guys today. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And that brings us to you, Dr. Marshausen.
Thank you. On October 14th, we are hosting Dr. Shatkin, who's the author of the book, Born to Be Wild. Last I heard, we were 600 seats sold. Is that about right? Almost a 400. Okay. And it's free, but we'd like you to register so that we know how many people are there. There will be a limit. Between 6 to 7, there'll be an open house with first responders and crisis support organizations. At 6 o'clock, we will have our board meeting in Kaufman's Media Center, and we will structure the agenda on the 14th so that we can then be in the auditorium by 7 o'clock to hear Dr. Shatkin. I am thrilled at our community partners who have agreed to be co-sponsors of this: the City of Dublin, Washington Township Fire and Rescue, Jerome Township Fire and Rescue. So this is a community-wide event, as you know, and you've heard me say before, we hear the stories about the kids who are videotaping their speedometer when they drive 120 miles an hour and then post it. Why? And how, as parents and educators and adults and mentors in kids' lives, when we see this and hear this, how do we connect with kids to stop the next horrible event that could happen when risky behavior takes place? So we were thrilled to have Dr. Shatkin as our psychiatrist in residence, who is available for us as a district to help with these types of events, and thrilled to welcome him here on the 14th. Whoops. Both Mrs. Rigby and Mrs. Messick touched on sometimes we have to say no. And what allows us to be able to do that is being consistent in our application, in our policies, and our guidelines across the district. We're going to have to be consistent in our application of schedule processes and where we go over and what's the process by which, if we put 27 third graders in a building, what's the process we use so we can be consistent. Our welcome center has been, our enrollment center has been inundated as the year starts with new families from all over. In fact, Mr. Andres shared today some of the new families who have enrolled in Thomas Elementary School, and the list is worldwide when you look at where we're getting new students from. As we go through our process, you go to school where you live, and we're consistent with that application. We had some upset parents when we said no food or drink in our stadiums on a Friday night means no food or drink in our stadiums on a Friday night. And we are now being consistent in all 3 locations with what that means. We're consistent with our application of our cell phone guidelines. And if it's all, that means all. So as we do this, this is how we build trust. And when people are upset, but we say that we're consistent, that has to be the case, and we're getting really solid at that consistency across the board. That's also holding true with our redistricting process and our timelines. There's been a lot of interest in the addition on Scioto High School. We've said we're going to get elementary and middle school done first. Cropper GIS has their input form available on the website, and they continue to get input on that elementary and middle school process. We don't have the place where you can give suggestions on what we should be doing at high school yet. That's not going to start until early 2025, and we're going to be consistent in that application of that process. So as we work through this, we want everyone to know when we put these practices in place, there's a reason, and it's so that we can keep a pretty solid cadence and we can make sure that we get everything done in a way that we're able to pay attention to it, that we're able to take that feedback, and that we're able to maintain a laser focus on the things that are most important to us.
Dr. Marshausen, real quick, if you can go back to the previous slide. I just had this question come up a couple of times this week, and since some folks in the community rewatch the board meetings when they don't have anything else going on, can you touch on why we aren't doing the high school redistricting at the same time as elementary, middle school?
Why we're not?
Why we are not?
Well, first of all is we had started this with Mr. Cropper ahead of time. And secondly, we want to have the parameters in place and our middle school boundary set, and then we can start looking at what our high schools will look like. The students who will be 8th graders next year, we want to make sure that they're not moved multiple times. So we get the middle school set and we get those boundaries set, and then we can move on to the high school side. There is also an immediacy on the elementaries because Bishop Elementary will open next fall. The addition on Scioto won't open until the next fall. So we have to get that elementary piece done, and this allows us to get those feeders into the middle schools. And then when we set the parameters with Cropper, we'll be able to say, we don't want middle school split more than twice, for example. If the middle schools are set, then when we say we're not going to split middle schools more than twice, we have that as a consistent model already. So as we go through this, we started early, and this allows us to kind of stay focused on each step. Safety and security. All too often, we find ourselves sitting at school board meetings, reacting and responding to a tragedy that's happened someplace else in the country. And the tragedy in Georgia, and as all the information comes out, we all get to learn from things that were done well, and we get to learn from things that may have been missed along the process. And we don't know what that is yet. There's lots of media reports. There are a lot of people making statements. But one of the things that is amazing about law enforcement agencies across our country, everyone will be working with FBI and Homeland Security to unpack what could have been done differently, and we all will have the opportunity to learn from a tragic situation. It's not just for us, though, when something happens someplace else that we focus on this. The email that went out to our community last Thursday, we had prepared to go out this week because we were going to send that all out this week, and Cassie and her team pushed that up a little bit early. Honestly, more people probably read it than if it had come and it had just come on a regular week. This isn't all the time for us. I had breakfast this morning with Chief Pice and our fire chiefs that serve the community. We do that once a month. Our cadence of working to make sure we do what's possible to keep our kids safe is what we do all the time. The other thing in our community that works really well is because of Chief Pice's role and our police role in our schools, we also have immediate access and support from the FBI, JTTF, Homeland Security. When we get a SWAT threat at Wyandotte Elementary, it's being analyzed up to the highest levels. We want our parents to know this. We trained at what happened at Wyandotte. that training worked when we have a situation. We'll continue to learn from experiences and events that happen elsewhere and look for opportunities for us to provide a safer environment for our kids. Mrs. Rigby and I had a conversation about the devices that some of the teachers were wearing that allowed them to push a button and communicate quickly with first responders. It's, of course, something that we will take a look at. We do work with audio enhancements in some of our buildings already, and they do have a product similar to that. So it's something that we will, of course, continue to look at. And we're never satisfied in this area. It's something that the safety of our students and our staff is something that is of utmost importance all the time. On September 23rd, our next board meeting, reminder to everybody, we're going to be at City Council chambers. This is when we recognize our National Merit semifinalists. I think that list comes out on Wednesday, so they're not going to get a lot of time before the invitation. But most of the time, they tend to make it, and we are very proud because we pack that room. For this being the second board meeting of the month, our public participation will follow the recognition of our National Merit semifinalists so that they can get their pictures done, be announced, and get out and get on with their evening and their celebratory dinners. And then we'll move on to our public participation on that evening at the City Council chambers. We are very grateful that City Council allows us to use those chambers. They still seem kind of new. It's a great place to be able to sit up on that dais and have that big meeting for us. We'd never fit all those folks in here. Are there any questions from members of the board for me? Okay, Mrs. Dietrich.
Good evening. Just here to share one thing. As Mrs. Gillis mentioned, the Alumni Hall of Fame ceremony will be held at Jerome this Friday, September 13th. We have 6 inductees that we will induct into the Hall of Fame on Friday, and we're very excited, and it's fun because it's at Jerome, so they will participate in the parade and some extras that we don't get to see every year. So we're excited for that and look forward to having everyone join us.
Okay. Moving on to reports from the Treasurer's Office.
Tonight we have 2 donations for your approval on the agenda tonight. One from the DEA, Dublin Education Association, for $4,000 to purchase books at Scioto High School. And then we also have a donation from Chapman PTO for just shy of $3,000 to purchase a new laminator, color printer, and papers and ink. Then we also have 2 student activity reports or purpose clauses for you to approve. And this gives us the ability to make a cash account and collect revenue and help them with their financial tracking.
Thank you. It is recommended by the Treasurer that the Board of Education approve items 6B and 6C. Is there a motion?
So moved.
So moved by Mrs. Messick. Is there a second?
Second.
Second by Mrs. De Silva. If you could call the roll, please.
Mrs. Messick,
Yes.
Mrs. De Silva,
Yes.
Mrs. Rigby,
Yes.
Mr. Valentine,
Yes.
Mrs. Gillis.
Yes, motion passes 5-0. And that brings us to academics and student learning.
Okay, just a quick update before I pass it on to Mrs. Marple. Mrs. Rigby mentioned feedback from the Scioto staff for the addition they'll be getting. So just to clarify, there's actually 2 steps to this. On Wednesday, the entire Scioto staff is invited. Doesn't mean they have to go, but they're invited to go to Jerome High School at 3:30 to tour the new addition. Anyone can go. And then Mr. Cochran is going to put together a team of about 10 to 12 leaders who will kind of share some considerations. Those considerations will come through Mr. Cochran, Mr. Ulring, and myself, and we will attend the meetings that Mr. Stark hosts about the new addition. This is not an open invitation for our public, but board members, you are, of course, welcome to come to Jerome at 3:30 on Wednesday if you'd like to join us. Now, Mrs. Marple.
Thank you, Dr. Schwanke. I'm excited to share tonight that planning is well underway for the implementation of all-day kindergarten for next fall. So as you know, there's many logistics, including operational logistics and instructional logistics that will go into preparing for these young learners to be in our care all day long. I have been working very closely with Sam Althouse, and we have a team of building principals and district leaders that have met a few times already. And we really have 3 events that are going to aid in the implementation of this new programming. Starting at the end of this month, in September, we will be taking small teams of kindergarten teachers and principals on 3 site visits. The goal of those site visits will be to visit some local districts that have all-day kindergarten and have made that switch. We'll visit some classrooms, we'll talk to some teachers, and we'll also talk to district leaders to hear what kinds of planning they put in place and what they may have done different if they could do it now all over again. And then we'll bring all of that information back from 3 partners to what we're calling a planning retreat. We're pulling a small team for 2 days. During those 2 days, we will engage with a combo of teachers and administrators. And when I say teachers, I'm encompassing Chris's department as well as classroom teachers as well. We'll be talking about what does the daily routine look like? What does the instructional routine look like? What does the addition of related arts at kindergarten mean for our students, our teachers, and the schedule? What additional supports need to be in place? What kind of interventions do we need to get prepared for? Does this change anything about what we currently do for onboarding of our kindergartners? What kind of communication needs to happen both in our buildings internally and with our parents and stakeholders as implementation comes closer? And then that third component, once we plan, there'll be a lot of communication, and Sam and I are going to work with the principals closely on that communication. And then once staffing occurs in the spring, we intend to pull the kindergarten teachers, some experienced maybe with the half-day program here, some maybe new to that full-day kindergarten or maybe even kindergarten, and do some teacher training for them in the spring before they leave for summer. And if more support's needed after that day, we can discuss what that would look like at that time. But we're excited for this, and if anybody has any questions, I'm happy to answer. If not, I will pass it on to Mr. Andrus.
It's funny, there are some people out there who think, oh, the kids are just coming for an extra couple hours. How hard can it be? And it's real hard. And I'm not even Lori.
And fun.
Yeah. So we have a couple of very exciting things happening in student services this month, and I've known about them for a while, but now it's September and everything is here. Next Tuesday, we'll have our first meeting of the Behavior Task Force Guiding Coalition. So this will be a group of 21 individuals that represent the district, from preschool to Emerald Campus, from Riverside to Eversole Run. Our task will be to clearly articulate the different needs as it relates to student behavior that we have across the district, and then create teams to address those specific needs, all through the lens of R-Factor. And I want to give you an example of a great quote that I think does this. I've come to the frightening conclusion that I am the decisive element in the classroom. It's my personal approach that creates the climate. It's my daily mood that makes the weather. In all situations, it is my response that decides whether a crisis will be escalated or de-escalated. And this quote comes from an individual named Chaim Janot, who actually died in 1977. So this quote is well over 50 years old, something that people have been talking about and working on for so long. But it reminds us that we don't control events, but we do control our response, and we control our 20 square feet, whether we're a student or a parent or a teacher. So in a future update, I'll share more about the teams that we create and the tasks that each of those teams will accomplish. I also want to take a minute to elaborate on what Mrs. Rigby had mentioned about the New Solutions K-12 group. Even since your meeting, we've found ways to expand and include more voices in that work. So exactly 1 week after the Behavior Task Force, we'll have the NSK-12 Guiding Coalition. And that, again, is improving outcomes for students with disabilities, gifted and talented, and English learners. A different 21-member team will have a 2-hour discussion on areas of strength and need, and then the people from NSK-12 get to finish with 12 30 to 60-minute personal interviews with our district leadership team. 2 days later, on the 26th, they will be back for a Fast and Furious Day where 2 of their staff members are going to visit 12 buildings, so 6 and 6. And in those 6 building visits in one day, they will see 4 classrooms at each building. So, Lori, what is that math?
You're supposed to ask me before you rattle off the numbers.
They'll see at least 48 different classrooms across the district. They're going to visit special education, gifted, general ed class, EL classrooms, all different levels. So they get a good picture of what our district really is. And that'll be before they start to engage in additional on-site interviews, at least 30 focus groups with over 200 different stakeholders, including parents. Now, at a previous meeting, I believe, Ms. DeSilva, you asked me about parents. So we're going to ask our special ed coordinators, of course our buildings will help us, but coordinators and DMARCs, our special education parent mentor, to help us identify parents of children with disabilities who might be interested in this opportunity. We're going to ask our gifted intervention specialist, Rachel Dobney, in our buildings to try to find some parents of children who are gifted and talented at all different levels. And then our EL teachers, Erica Stone, Benji Trotter, our bilingual aid supervisor, and our bilingual aides to try to find parents who might be interested in sharing their EL perspective. The EL perspective is an interesting one. We want to make sure that we find different groups of individuals with different languages and different experiences. So there might be multiple focus groups as it relates to our English learners. And of course, we'll have lots of opportunities for our staff, certified, classified staff, to provide feedback. So with everybody's busy schedules, that's going to take a while. I also want to give just a big thanks to Jessica Sullivan, Scott Gill, and Pat O'Neill for their assistance pulling data. That data will make sure that NSK-12 sees what we do here, talks about best practices, but also uses data to ground everything back to making sure that what we do has data and research behind the changes and improvements that we hope to make. So if I make it through September, I'll give you an update at the meeting in November. Thank you.
Dr. Swanke, would you like to explain Branch Out before we vote upon it?
Mr. Andrus, would you like to explain Branch Out? Let's play hot potato here for a moment.
Yeah, absolutely. So in special education and student services, we don't have the ability to find high-quality substitutes for certain positions. And often we lean on the same either companies or individuals who work with us. We're always looking for additional support for speech language therapists, occupational therapists, physical therapists, school psychologists, and mental health specialists. Because when somebody goes out, it's not as simple sometimes as it is for a classroom teacher where we contact the ESC, we put in a request for a sub, and they show up. So the reason that we have this on the board agenda tonight is to have an additional individual who can provide us support for maternity leaves, other medical leaves, or other supports that we might need as we increase or support our kids in the area of speech services.
And if I can add something, Mr. Andrus, it becomes an issue because if there's a certain number of minutes that a child needs on their IEP and there's an absence, then we would be out of compliance and not meeting that child's needs. So to have a substitute is needed for that. And also you can't, many times our principals will pull from other places to fill a substitute position. You can't do that with speech, OT, PT, that kind of thing. Is that an important add-on, Mr. Andrus?
I apologize for missing that very, very important part. Yes, compliance matters.
You're welcome.
And often IEPs are written monthly, so we can't push timelines. We have to make sure that we get a certain number of minutes in a certain number of weeks or months.
Fantastic. Thank you guys so much. All right. It is recommended by the superintendent that the Board of Education approve the agreement for Branch Out Therapy. Is there a motion?
So moved.
So moved by Mrs. Rigby. Is there a second?
Second.
Second by Mr. Valentine. Call the roll, please.
Mrs. Rigby,
Yes.
Mr. Valentine,
Yes.
Mrs. Gillis,
Yes.
Mrs. De Silva,
Yes.
Mrs. Messick.
Yes. Motion passes 5-0. Reports from Department of Operations.
Good evening. We just only have 3 short items. 2 of them are transportation related. One is the approval of the bus stops for the 24-25 school year. The other transportation one is the list of payment in lieu for those routes deemed impractical. And lastly is a resolution, and I explained this a little bit on last week's board report, as a settlement with the district and Sprint, now owned by T-Mobile, for the cellular tower that was using inadvertently District Electric.
All right, wonderful. It's recommended by the superintendent, the Board of Education approve items 10A through 10C. Is there a motion?
So moved.
So moved by Mrs. De Silva. Is there a second?
Second.
Second by Mrs. Messick. Call the roll, please.
Mrs. De Silva,
Yes.
Mrs. Messick,
Yes.
Mrs. Gillis,
Yes.
Mr. Valentine,
Yes.
Mrs. Rigby.
Yes.
Motion passes 5-0, and that brings us to Human Resources.
All right, I will start tonight with our certified agenda, and the first item you'll see is for retirement for Chris Huseman. Want to thank Mr. Huseman for his 25 years in Dublin City Schools. He'll be retiring at the end of May from Carr Middle School. You'll also see that we have a few salary changes on tonight with a leave request and then 1 6-period pay that we added on as well. There's lots of supplementals, and again, that's pretty typical this time of year. They cover academics, clubs, extracurriculars, and building level leadership. And then there's just a few athletics on as well. And so moving on to our classified agenda, you'll see 4 resignations and then 9 new hires as we continue to staff those positions for this new school year. And then you'll see 2 unpaid leave of absences as well. And then finally, on our stipends, you'll see 7 of them. The first is a revision that's a previously approved stipend that the board approved late last school year for teacher training. It adds a staff member who was left out of the original approval. There are 5 stipends for middle school 6th grade orientation. That's to pay teachers who came in during the summer to help with incoming 6th graders. And then the last item is for the 2025 Dublin Literacy Conference, and that's scheduled to take place on February 1st of 2025. And that concludes the HR agenda for tonight.
Thank you so much. It is recommended by the superintendent that the Board of Education approve items 12A through 12C. Is there a motion?
So moved.
So moved by Mr. Valentine. Is there a second?
Second.
Second by Mrs. De Silva. Call the roll, please.
Mr. Valentine,
Yes.
Mrs. De Silva,
Yes.
Mrs. Messick,
Yes.
Mrs. Gillis,
Yes.
Mrs. Rigby.
Yes.
Motion passes 5-0. Do we have any items for board discussion or future agenda items before we adjourn? Nope. Okay, is there a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
So moved by Mrs. De Silva, second by Mrs. Rigby. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.